The world is at a critical juncture.
Breaking news tonight, Venezuela's leader captured by American forces.
Put Iran on notice. If they do anything bad to these people, we're going to hit them very hard.
The United States should have Greenland as part of the United States. There's no need to even think or talk about this in the context that you're asking of a military operation. Nobody's going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland.
Recent military operations in Venezuela, ambitions for the Trump administration to own Greenland, and Russia's escalations in Ukraine suggest that international law is ineffective at constraining powerful states from using force against other countries. Some also argue that international law should not even be under consideration when determining actions of strategic importance. But while international law is admittedly ineffective at holding these states accountable, its value, even from a realist and self-interested standpoint, should not be discounted. As hypocritical or unfair as it seems, the world is better off when international law is frequently violated than one when it is purely at the mercy of strength, force, and power, whoever happens to wield it. So, in light of recent military actions and the apparent dismissal of international law, is IL really meaningless? What about in a world dominated by spheres of influence, and do we really need it? Welcome to Season 2 of Bottom Line Up Front. Today is Sunday, January 11th, 2026. I'm Noah Tan, and this is BLUF number 8. Is international law a fool's errand? Let's be clear. Making international law is hard, and oftentimes it's too hard. Two of the biggest hurdles that international law constantly struggles to overcome are the inherent realities that it cannot bind actions to which states have not consented, and that it lacks an international police force as an enforcement mechanism. Recent news since the last season of BLUF has shown the fragility of international law as a meaningful institution. The US captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in a January 3rd operation titled Operation Absolute Resolve, where Delta forces illegally, under international law, launched strikes in the capital city of Caracas and brought Maduro to trial in the Southern District of New York. US President Donald Trump did not rule out a military operation to take ownership of Greenland after Danish officials stated that the semi-autonomous region was not for sale. And the Iranian regime has demonstrated a wanton disregard for international law in recent protests by open firing upon protesters, killing more than 200. Critics of international law have commonly argued that it is a meaningless, unenforceable jumble of ideals and norms that are sometimes followed, sometimes not, and often with little accountability for the most powerful states that break it. This view was aptly summed up in a recent interview by the New York Times with President Trump when asked whether he needed to abide by international law. Quote, "It depends what your definition of international law is," he said, adding, "I don't need international law. I'm not looking to hurt people." And when asked about the limits of his power in global affairs, he stated, quote, "Yeah, there is one thing, my own morality, my own mind. It's the one thing that can stop me." But if the world is one truly, quote, governed by strength, force, and power, as Homeland Security Advisor Stephen Miller puts it, why do powerful countries still often invoke international law to justify their actions? In other words, why would Russian President Vladimir Putin waste his time using Article 51 self-defense and humanitarian interventions as justifications for invading Ukraine instead of just saying, well, we're going in because we want to? Deal with it. The answer may lie not in what international law was meant to do, but the practical roles it plays in a constant struggle for spheres of influence. First, international law is as much a product of power as it is a protection from it. I have a slightly different view on things, one that neither dismisses international law as nebulous hand-waving, nor naively puts it on a pedestal as a paragon of state cooperation. International law was never, and is not grounded, in the constructivist ideas of social norms, identities, and cultures around which NGOs, church groups, and some international organizations revolve. The modern concept of international relations and law emerged from the Peace of Westphalia and motivated by the 30 Years' War, which brought unsustainable suffering for all parties but also revealed clear winners and losers. It also established a pillar of international relations: anarchy, a world in which the removal of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor eliminated any forms of a world police and established the principle of state sovereignty. Later iterations and restatements of international laws have either been born from the pen of a war's victor or a reflection of powerful states' ideals. The Concert of Europe gave the victors of the Napoleonic Wars the formal right to intervene in other countries. The Treaty of Versailles gave the victors of World War I recourses for acquiring wartime reparations. The UN Charter that we know today was written by the victors of World War II. The creation of international law has always been about power or the ideals of the powerful, not the reflection of constructivist ideals of states with true sovereign immunity. This has drawn fierce criticisms from those that are not in the inner circle, especially among states in the global south. Countries have critiqued international law for hegemony, colonialism, and legal mechanisms to deontologically justify what powerful states wanted to do in the first place. Now let's turn to the idea that people are bringing up that we are entering a time of spheres of influence, where the US has its backyard, Russia has its backyard, China has its backyard, and so on. And how spheres of influence can act as a regional police force of sorts. Aside from self-defense and intervention by invitation, states can normally intervene only after it has received approval from the UN Security Council under Chapter 7 authority. But with China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US as permanent members of the UNSC, Security Council resolutions are often vetoed by other adversaries on the Council. Given the several examples of uninvited and unauthorized foreign intervention into countries' domestic conflicts, military intervention has often been conducted by powerful states or coalitions of states acting unilaterally and outside their jurisdiction. In 1979, France deposed Emperor Bokassa I in the Central African Republic after reports emerged that he had participated in the massacre of schoolchildren, despite no UN authorization or invitation. The US deposed Manuel Noriega, the de facto leader of Panama, in 1989 without UN approval. And famously in 2003, a coalition of US and UK forces led an invasion into Iraq to depose Saddam Hussein on legally ambiguous grounds of anticipatory self-defense and UNSC authorization implied by Resolution 678 and Resolution 1441. But in each of these cases, leaders have turned to justifications grounded in international law, despite having the military advantage to render it unnecessary. France recognized David Dacko as the legitimate leader of the Central African Republic and invoked his request for French military assistance as an invitation for intervention. In Panama, U.S. President George H.W. Bush invoked intervention by invitation by the U.S.-recognized leader Guillermo Endara, and Article 51 defense after a U.S. Marine lieutenant was killed by Noriega's forces. And in 2003, George W. Bush justified the Iraq War based on the UN resolutions above. So, international law is not meaningless, otherwise it wouldn't be invoked so much as justifications for consequent violations of international law. But the lack of an international and independent police force has meant that international law is written and interpreted by the regional hegemons that have the power to enforce it by military action and or economic coercion. That's the inherent trade-off. The same states that can materially enforce international law with men, military, and money are the same states that cannot fully be held accountable to international law. So, what does this mean in today's world? This brings up the question, can international law function effectively in today's world? The days of a unipolar world are quickly fading. International law used to largely be what the US made it because the US was the world's only superpower. That is no longer the case. The rise of China, the commitment of the US to the so-called Donroe Doctrine, the audacity of Russian forces in Ukraine, and the ongoing spat between the UAE and Saudi Arabia over proxy control in Yemen signals emerging spheres of influence, each led by the regional hegemon that has the might to enforce its version of international law. For every action that one global power uses international law to justify, an adversarial global power will denounce it using the same thing. An Iranian army chief warned the US and Israel not to meddle in what he calls internal affairs, usually protected under international law by the principle of domain reserve. Israel and the US may invoke principles of humanitarian intervention to justify the very actions that Iran deems illegal under international law. According to Beijing's One China principle, it may justify an invasion of Taiwan as a domestic issue and outside of international law's justifications for extraterritorial military action, even if Taiwan invited such response. However, Taiwanese allies could argue that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan constitutes a significant threat to peace and therefore act in collective self-defense. And the clearest example of this seemingly paradoxical relationship is between the US and Russia. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the US criticized the Kremlin for violating Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. When the US captured Maduro, Russia criticized Washington for the very same reason. Here is the world with which we must contend. And so this is the question we must now ask ourselves. In a world of self-interested states, in a world where power is the only variable, and where legal justifications are invoked only when they are convenient, in a world of anarchy with eroding international institutions, can international law still function from purely rational, practical, and transactional standpoints? International law is a fool's errand, but the world will always be run by fools. We cannot expect to live in a perfect world where everyone and every country perfectly abides by international law. We are humans. We sometimes are fools, and thinking that we are anything but is, well, foolish. So what if China invades Taiwan? What if the US seizes Greenland? What if international law is wholly incapable of preventing violations of international law because the most powerful violators can get away with it? And is there a minimum amount of international law that survives in a world governed by force? I'd like to answer these questions in two parts. First, when I say violations of international law, I am making a descriptive claim, not a normative one. One must keep in mind the sad reality that compliance with international law is a double standard. The worst dictators, war criminals, and terrorists do not even glance at international law before committing mass atrocities, and it is sometimes necessary to violate the letter of international law for the spirit of what it was meant to protect. Many good things have come as a result of international law violations. The deposition of Maduro potentially opens up the door for a freer Venezuela after years of political repression and human rights violations. The illegal Tanzanian invasion of Uganda in 1971 deposed Idi Amin, a ruthless dictator responsible for human rights abuses, mass murder in the hundreds of thousands, ethnic persecution, and economic devastation. Under a strict reading of the UN Charter, the 1999 NATO intervention in Kosovo was impermissible under international law, but notably ended the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo Albanians by Serbian forces and added to the idea of humanitarian intervention under international law, admittedly a highly contested element, but one nonetheless. Second, international law only makes the headlines for its failures and is rarely credited for the everyday processes that it helps to coordinate. For the same reason why we can send diplomats to other countries without worrying about extrajudicial imprisonments, we can also expect rational, even selfish actors to still stay largely within the guardrails of international law. Less public invocation of international law might mean that it's actually working as intended. So until I'm proven otherwise, and feel free to mock me all you want if I turn out to be wrong, even people like Stephen Miller at least consider the constraints of international law, not because they ascribe the normative utopia that they falsely promise to create, but because it provides stability and some reciprocity from adversary. As I've said before, international law is written by the victor's pen, so the powerful states that cast international law aside when it doesn't suit them are the same states that benefit the most from international law. It is a way for raw power to be formalized into legitimate authority. Contravening international law may thus go against the long-term interests of powerful states that rely on reciprocal compliance from less powerful ones. Violating international law is contagious and sets precedents. For instance, the US could easily use its superior fleet to just take what it wants without due regard to the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. However, if the US stops following UNCLOS, it loses the legal right to demand that China or Iran respect international shipping lanes and must defend international waters through blood and treasure rather than legal high ground. Furthermore, powerful states will naturally feel impervious to the consequences of violating international law, but they operate under the assumption that they will maintain this great power status indefinitely. As Thucydides put it in the Melian dialogue, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. The once great power of Great Britain certainly felt like it could do what it wanted at the expense of its colonies. But the decline of the pound sterling as the reserve currency and the Suez Canal crisis saw the tumble of the UK as a superpower in favor of the United States. It was fortunate for the UK that Uncle Sam became a close friend and not a fierce enemy. International law provides a baseline, a standard in which powerful states enjoy the privilege of deviating from it at times with few existential repercussions. But this is a delicate balance. Push your luck too far and you may have to sleep in the bed you made if power changes hands. For all its flaws, and there are many, it is the reason why we trust our planes to land safely at international airports, why we hope prisoners of war are treated with a minimal standard of care, why countries sometimes bring others to the International Court of Justice instead of bombing each other, and why the US and Philippines tie their mutual defense treaty to principles based in the UN Charter to signal an effective deterrent to Chinese attacks in the Pacific. Saying international law is meaningless is not only reductive, but it's also hubristic. Who knows what conflicts will emerge in the future, what new global powers will become insulated to the checks of international law, or what breakthroughs in new military technology may be deployed without commensurate defenses and without the baseline standards of state behavior. As hypocritical or unfair as it seems, I'd rather live in a world where international law exists and is frequently violated than one purely at the mercy of strength, force, and power. This has been Bottom Line Upfront. Bottom Line Upfront is written entirely outside of Noah's professional capacity. His views are not necessarily representative of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace or Stanford University. Noah declares no conflicts of interest. All errors are his own. Thanks for listening.